Wish I had blood more pudding. The Chinese perspective.
The Chinese stand to
Ooh.
strike the era of the fastest economic growth in all of history. They went from being a poverty-stricken nation 40 years ago, economically on par with a lot of
Wow.
African countries, to by some measurements being the largest economy in the world. Due to this meteoric rise, China's bursting with energy and confidence right now. China's rise has been so fast that it hasn't caught up politically, and the Chinese don't even control their own neighborhood. Let's briefly compare it to America, which is surrounded on both sides of
There
the
we
oceans.
go. Uh, Canada, American client state. Holy shit. American client state. Mexico is other American allies. Other American allies here. Effectual enemies. Well, in Taiwan's case, Japan, India, and other Asian countries say they would protect Taiwan. Really?
And
That's
basically has its
interesting.
entire hemisphere as some degree of satellite, with a couple notable exceptions. China's bordered by Vietnam and India that despise it, and are American allies, alongside Russia to the north that's a completely untrustworthy ally. Even its allies like North Korea, Kazakhstan, and Burma are unstable and don't even like the Chinese that much. When you look at China's actions, you can see the
That's
result
true.
of this geographic insecurity, in that America could hypothetically sail right up to the Chinese coastline, but at the same time, the historic insecurity that comes from China's century of humiliation. Under the Qing dynasty 200 years ago, China believed itself to be the greatest nation in the world, but from
Huh.
1840 to 1945, China faced
Nope.
defeat and humiliation at the hands of Western powers in Japan, with death tolls around 150 million, if you count disease and famine. It's impossible to
The only
understand
country that
Taiwan's
likes China
situation
is
when we're
North
not in
Korea.
this
That's
perspective.
absolutely
The
true.
Chinese feel the need to regain the honor they
And it's
lost.
very dangerous because, there's always talks about China being a global superpower and whatever. If they truly want to be a superpower, they need to control or at least influence a little bit more their own neighborhood. And they aren't doing it. So that's very
This
dangerous
century
for
of
them.
humiliations by pushing for symbolic victories like Taiwan or the split
Ay, ay,
states,
ay,
which
man.
in of themselves don't matter a tremendous amount on the
China is
international
an
stage.
honor
Something
culture.
that's also really key is the symbolic importance Taiwan has is that it's run by the old Chinese Nationalist Party, which the Chinese Communist Party gained power from in the Civil War 80 years ago. The Communist and Nationalist parties sort of justify their existence in opposition to the other.
Yep.
Thus, it's also considered important to the Communist Party's honor that Taiwan is seized. At the same time, Taiwan's a model for another trajectory of Chinese civilization, one that's democratic and richer than the communist, which is a threat to the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy. China's more afraid of Taiwan as a symbol to people in
Japan has been growing its military for a few years for a time like this. That's very interesting and again, very symbolic as well. When was the last time Japan had a large army? World War II. So that just got to show you how shit's gonna go down eventually. China even lost to Vietnam. That's true when they tried to invade. Damn. We're all defeated by Vietnam at some point. Catch 22 though. They need the foreign outage to boost nationalism internally, so they stay in power. Yeah, China has no friends, only economic partners. That's true. China doesn't have a lot of friends,
China
especially
and
like
rally against their
America, for
rule than
example.
the tiny island that it really is. When Westerners look at China, we tend to see its strength, and that's largely what the Communist Party wants us to see, but we don't see its weaknesses. A situation I go into depth in this video, the link to which is in the description. We don't see China's horrible demographic structure, for example, how their birth rates are.
Did we watch this video, guys? I don't think we watched this. Maybe we should, but we watched. And if you guys are watching on YouTube, for example, the Chinese Reckoning series, and that was amazing.
Quarter of what it should be, and they'll have half their population in 80-year time. Alternatively, their immense class, systemic, and resource problems. China, like most newly industrialized nations, is burning with energy, but it's also exhausted.
China's only scary because of numbers alone and not much else.
It's no coincidence that the U.S. fought a civil war during its industrialization. Europe was
No,
wrecked
just
a
came
generation
out.
after industrialization, with world wars and Japan in the same camp. The Chinese Communist Party stayed in power for so much longer than other international communist parties by implicitly buying support from the Chinese people with economic.
Literally buying
As China
support.
becomes a more mature economy, and it also gets involved in trade wars, it slows its economic growth. And as I talk about in this video, the government pushes for both nationalism and oppressive authoritarian measures as a way to keep.
Gosh, look at that. Housing sales 25.6% up? which is insane, dude. When you consider the housing crisis that they are
Over its
facing.
own population. When China pushes for Taiwan, it's
Everyone
not
against
doing
that.
it
When
out of
Japan
either
get pissed and
strength
bust
or
out the real
weakness, but
military
almost like a
power.
drug induced burst
True.
of confidence that comes from a profound insecurity over its position. The parallels in World War I are horrifying. There's this thing called Thucydides' trap, which is basically that a dominant power is incentivized to try to crush a rising power before said rising power is strong enough to overtake the dominant one. There was a study that found there were 15 examples of this over the last 500 years, and that 12 of them resulted in war. From this logic, the US should fight a war with China before China is capable of overtaking America. For decades, the US and China worked together since they could make a
This is kind of true, but I really don't like this argument that much because people seem to forget that we live in a globalized economy, right? Why would China and the US go to war if China sells its products to the US, right? Like China is the biggest exporter of products in the world and the US is the largest consumer market in the world. It's like the perfect relationship, right? America is full of Chinese goods and China loves selling its goods to the US. So it just financially, from an economic point of view, it doesn't really make a lot of sense that China and the US go to war for either of them, right? If war between the West and China happened, I could see India doing a lot of fighting. So yeah, that's true. I could also see that. They have border issues or territories in dispute, so I could see that happening.
lot of money from trading with each other. The US ignored China's rise to great power as well as American industry's relocation there. However, starting a little bit with Obama and really ramping up with Trump, the United States started to see China more as a rival. This was driven partially by the social unrest
Exactly.
in
Yeah.
America due
Both
to
they both lose,
deindustrialization, but also by China's greater geopolitical predominance and aggression. Thus, with
and I think they both understand that. In a war, both of them lose.
America's changed views on China, it's been making more pro
Especially now that America has a lot of supply chain issues.
Taiwanese stances. Although Taiwan in real terms has been an American ally since the beginning, the US has recognized Communist China as the real China in official documents in a weird dance. Starting with Trump, the US has been breaking diplomatic taboo.
Look, in blue, the countries that recognize Taiwan, and you got only what? Paraguay, Guatemala. Is this Honduras or Nicaragua? I don't know. I can't remember.
Like the US president taking direct phone calls from the Taiwanese one. For the Chinese coming from a shame-based culture, this is an attack upon their honor as a nation. The US sees a China that's spreading its influence and that scares America, which forces the US's hand in a
Yeah,
lot of
look,
ways.
again, mostly American allies. You got India, you got Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia, Taiwan, or as they call it, Chinese Taipei. You got Japan, Korea.
The US maintains an alliance structure that includes Taiwan, but also the whole Pacific perimeter around China,
Yeah.
including Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, South Korea.
And then the South China Sea
The problem
thing
with
gets very
alliance
interesting.
structures is that they're maintained more by pride than by military force. Thus, if the US let China take Taiwan without a fight, that would precipitate a crisis in America as the world's policeman, which might result in a collapse of the already weak US.
I don't think economic interdependence is enough to always prevent war, since humans aren't rational. At times, we're motivated by fear, pride, anger. That is true, but you don't. No, you don't only have economic interdependence. You also have the fear of mutual destruction, right? That's when it comes to nuclear powers. So you got Russia, China, the U.S. of course, and then you got like France, the U.K. So you combine economic interdependence with the fear of mutual destruction. Uh, it's just very unlikely. I'm not saying it's impossible. Maybe it could happen, right? Like you said it, humans are not very rational at times, but I just think it's very, very, very unlikely. And I think it's more likely, it's something like the Ukraine thing, where China goes to war with Taiwan and we just supply them with weapons. That or something like the Cold War, where we have a lot of proxy wars happening. I think that's also realistic. The U.S. and China could have a war, but I think it's very, very unlikely. Basically, all former imperial Japanese colonies are allies of America. Yeah, that's funny, isn't it? Thailand was also a strong ally for a long time. I'm not pro China. I think the Chinese Communist Party is evil, but America has an incredible evil side to which should not be ignored. No, I totally agree with you. America has a side that's not particularly great, but when I always ask people, who would you rather be the global superpower, China or America? America is bad, and it has been imperialistic many times. Uh, but China is a very hardcore surveillance state, right? China has very few individual liberties, if any. America, you do have freedom of speech in America, and that's pretty great. Sometimes people have it for granted, but I think China is worse, honestly.
Dollar, or US allies leaving the American alliance structure, possibly going to China, which might look to be a more stable ally and the power of the future. If I was part of the American leadership, I would try to isolate China, gradually strangling it rather than being direct. But a
Okay.
major
Potential American allies, the Russians and the Chinese are allies of convenience. They dislike each other in real terms. Russia could easily flip to be a U.S. ally. True, Central Asia's governments like China.
problem of all American international policy across
No
its
country is
history
perfect.
is that it
It's lesser
often
of two
lacks
evils.
subtlety in
Yeah.
gradation. Americans are always either in or out. The US would probably do something big and brash just out of its own nature. Also, like China and frankly everywhere else in the world, America's torn by its own class, political, and systemic issues that make effective political action more difficult. America's not united at home and
Yeah, America's
disorganized,
facing
which
a lot
means
of
that its
shit,
actions
though.
abroad will be more foolish and ineffective. The question I'm going to ask here is what factors normally create wars across history, and what's different about the US and China's struggle from the norm? I normally find it annoying when people say wars won't happen anymore. This is since that argument's been used so many times before in history, and it
I
was
just
wrong
used that
every
argument,
single
bro.
time. People thought that global trade made wars unprofitable, which is the argument people use today and before World War I. However, there is one point that has to be taken very seriously, which is nuclear weapons. The United States and Russia both have over 6,000 nukes, which means they could end modern civilization as we know it. This is the biggest reason why the Cold War never became a real war, in that nuclear weapons act as a deterrent against full-scale industrial war. However, the complication here is that
Yeah, I
China
use the trade argument and I stand by it, but at the same time, I think the nuclear argument is also very powerful.
only has 300 nukes, most of which are in regional missiles and so can't even hit North America. That means that the US has over 60 times as many nukes, which makes it look like the US has overwhelming superiority. However, the US, due to being a nation with at least a little bit of moral consciousness, is unwilling to wipe the nation of China off the face of the earth if they don't nuke America first. Both the
Yeah, of
US and China
course.
have signed treaties saying they won't use nuclear weapons, and that actually plays into China's self-interest, since they have a larger population industrial base, which would serve them better in a conventional war. However, even if the US and China decide not to use nukes, nukes are still on the table. The idea that the human race and hundreds of millions of lives could be at stake could make the situation more tense, just to say the least. If China were to invade Taiwan, the US might not intervene just due to fear of the possibility of nuclear weapons being used. So, nukes might prevent a
And that's what we were talking about, and that's what's happening with Ukraine. It's the exact same thing. It's not about avoiding war as so much asking, is it worth it? And for a lot of people in the US, Taiwan wouldn't be worth it. Just like Ukraine isn't worth it, right?
war, but they also might not. Thus, industrial wars only break out when one society views the survival of their society at risk. The American Civil War happened when the South knew that if things kept going the way they were, the industrializing North would abolish slavery democratically. World War I broke out when the British and French knew that if things kept going the way they were, that the Germans would dominate them, and the Germans had the same anxiety about the Russians. Both Japan and Germany's economies would have imploded if they didn't start World War II, thus probably removing their regimes from power. The brilliant historian David Hackett Fisher found that you can predict collapses in world systems with pretty easy regularity. I made a video about it here, but we can basically check out all the boxes pretty easily. High inflation and inequality, rising cost of living and declining standard of living, all of which cause international tension and civil wars. We basically know there's going to be a lot of wars in the next couple decades, but the question is whether the big worst case scenario of a full US-China war happens. The problem here is that the world system at this point, and you see this in both the US and China, is that both countries are crushed by their own internal problems, and so they try to tilt the world system to favor them. either by creating tariffs or shutting off immigration for America or gaining political power for China. However, when everyone needs concessions from the international system to keep their countries functioning, the world system just dies. The previous world crises that have happened have combined both internal and external wars. An example of this is how France fought the 30 Years' War and then collapsed into civil war. Or, in the 18th century, France had their own revolution and then fought the Napoleonic Wars.
It's all about
Russia
France,
fought World War
baby.
I, then collapsed into civil war. I think given China's massive demographic problems, there's no way the Communist Party stays in power. If their population's supposed to have by the end of this century, that means they're...
I personally don't think Taiwan is a hill the U.S. is willing to die on. I agree. This is evident since they don't recognize them as a real China since the 70s. True, it's what we're talking about. It's simply not worth it. You heard about the incident of that basketball player was racially attacked in China in the CBA. I know. I had no idea. There's a lot of racism in China against foreigners in general, so
going to have a remarkable
it wouldn't
social
surprise me,
collapse.
but
The
it
problem
sucks.
here is the sheer amount of chaos in modern world system makes it very difficult to predict actual results. As an example, a conflict between Chinese and American allies in a place like the Middle East or Eastern Europe could spiral into a war involving the US and China. It's hard to say what the exact conditions would be in a US-China war
American
or a
allies,
Chinese invasion
yo.
of Taiwan. So we're going to start here with the assumption that China does invade Taiwan. What would happen afterwards? Let's say that the Chinese fleet crosses the ocean to invade Taiwan. Most military projections in the US would say that China would be able to conquer Taiwan relatively easy, and I'm assuming Chinese war games say roughly the same. A major problem is that we don't have the important classified details that the Chinese and American governments do on combat details. I know some of the weapons...
Which, yeah, China would probably win, but it wouldn't be necessarily an easy war. I think Taiwan has a very respectable army, and of course, it's not like Russia and Ukraine, where it's just land. They have to cross water, and operations like D-Day, for example, they take a lot of money, a lot of skill, a lot of preparation, and an amphibian invasion is never easy, right? So it's not going to be super easy. According to the map he showed about U.S. allies, Ireland isn't our friend. Oh, really? That's weird. Yeah. Maybe neutrality. It's probably that because Switzerland and Finland are also like white. But I think the people of Ireland are probably really good when it comes to like America, right? I think China only political haters hates US, but that's it. They are more willing to cooperate with us than Russia. Yeah, that's true. I mean, the thing about China is that they really like cash, and they know that the US is all about the cash.
Is that we don't have the important classified details that the Chinese and American governments do on combat details. I know some of the weapon systems, but not how effective they are, for example. No major war was fought
Yeah,
like
exactly.
people expected,
Ireland
since
is
people
neutral.
calculate the importance of variables incorrectly. As an example, I've heard the Chinese have the ability to jam satellite signals off the coast of China that would destroy US naval communications, and that their missile force is extremely impressive. However, I'm not sure how effective either of these are in the real world. It's also totally possible that the US would be able to defeat the Chinese landing force given the US's much more powerful navy. Another factor is that amphibious invasions of well-defended coastlines are extremely difficult as a rule.
Yep.
Especially with a nation as well-armed and defended
Exactly.
as Taiwan.
Exactly.
As another possibility, once the Chinese reach the beachheads, it's entirely unclear how effective the Chinese military really is. As a rule, Chinese organizations tend to be pretty binary in either being extremely competent and efficient or mired in corruption.
We could block aid, then similar to what the UK did to Germany in World War One, it could cripple them, but could potentially escalate conflict. Sadly, new war could happen.
Largely determined by how honest the top leadership is.
My great-grandmother is 100 and lived under the Blitz. She always said to me, I hope your generation never has to see the things mine has seen. Wow, talk about a powerful message. I hope your generation never has to see what mine has to see. Oof. Brutal, but unfortunately true. I also hope that too. You can see the pain in her eyes when she said that. Imagine what she has seen. It's always very interesting to talk to the generation of World War II or World War One even.
Alternatively, it's unclear how effective the Taiwanese military is, either given that I've heard some reports saying it's really good, and others saying they have an outdated and foolish military doctrine. The biggest and primary question we have is whether the US would get involved to protect Taiwan. On one
I
side, the
don't think
Chinese
so.
attack on Taiwan is a direct attack on an American ally, and more abstractly, the American world order, which might result in US allies leaving America or the dollar world system.
I really
On the
don't
other
think
hand,
so.
starting a world war that would kill at least tens of millions of people over a tiny island is an expensive decision. Although it's really a coin toss, I think under the current
The
Biden administration, the
Democrats.
US is less likely to protect the island. I honestly think that the most likely option America would push for if China seizes
A
Taiwan is
blockade.
that America blocks off trade to China and puts the country under trade embargoes. The US Navy is extremely
Whew, well,
powerful.
this would be incredibly costly to the US. And I mean, talking about supply chain issues, would the US go there?
Well, it
Maybe,
can do this
maybe not,
easily, but the problem is that
right?
China
I
is
mean,
so dependent upon foreign trade, especially in fossil fuels from the Middle East, that it might launch into
hmm
war to protect its economic survival. Some of you might be reminded of the US embargo of Japan during World War II that practically forced the Japanese to declare war on America at Pearl
true,
Harbor.
true,
There are
100%
two
true.
ways of thinking about this, in that either the US would pursue this policy while forgetting
Haha,
history, and
Trump.
another that the US would cynically position China to
So
start the
fucking funny,
war
dude.
in order to make China look bad on the international stage and alienate its possible allies. Which brings up the question, would China push for another target after seizing Taiwan? If Taiwan was seized, it wouldn't solve any of China's internal problems, which might mean that they would need to go after something else. If returning to China's pre-century of humiliations is important, as it is for many Chinese nationalists, then the annexation of Mongolia, or more importantly the very strategic Okinawa Islands off the south coast of Japan, which have American military bases, might become new targets.
No,
However,
I
to
don't
be
think so.
honest, I think the Chinese pushing against America that directly is unlikely. I think saber rattling with India is more plausible. I think that if the US didn't start a war over Taiwan and engage China,
US corporations would cry if there was a blockade. True, absolutely. I don't think all the corporations in the US, I mean, we're talking about Apple, Amazon, right? Alphabet. You think I don't think all those corporations would be really happy about the blockade, and and even U.S. consumers. We consume a lot of products from China, so it'd be difficult. It wouldn't be ideal,
indirectly that
of
China would
course.
fall apart in the next few decades due to its own internal problems. I think the US could put the nail in the coffin by forming allies with Russia and promoting rebellions in Central Asia to fully surround and isolate China. However, a war with China would result in tens of millions of deaths in a truly history-forming war. A war I've gone over in more detail in that video. What a faultist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed
Woo! That was fucking good, man. I love geopolitics. I love all that shit, man. Come on. Yeah, I think war. I think we are close to war. I still don't think it's likely that we are gonna fight China or Russia directly. Directly, I don't think that we're gonna see like U.S. troops invading China or Russia. Like, come on. I think that's a little stretch. Now, maybe in a year things change and we're like, oh shit, war is actually very likely. But for now, I don't think it's gonna happen. However, we are very close to a lot of proxy wars. We have China and Taiwan, and we have Russia and Ukraine. And those two situations could really, really push some boundaries and could really affect immigration, trade, right? We're already having economic problems with some of the highest inflation levels we've faced since like the 70s. So I don't think any of that really helps. I hear every Chinese naval ship has an admiral and a CCP representative. The admiral can't do anything without consulting the Communist Party representative. Divine leadership isn't good. Yeah, if that's true, that's a really messed up decision. I'm not a naval officer or anything, but that's probably really, really tough. You need people that can make decisions quick, especially in like a very dire situation. Anyways, hey, it seems like we reached a top of like 18 viewers. That was our top. And I think we are right now at like 16, 17. I don't know. That's fucking cool, man. Thank you all so much for watching.